We're going to pass control now over to Chris Parkinson, who is a colleague that I've not met, but also from the University of Melbourne down at the VCA, and he's going to talk to us about the future of the city in the pandemic age also, but coming from a kind of phenomenological experience, I'd say, from what I judge from the abstract.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Audrey, and the coordinators of this dialogue, and for welcoming me here. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that I am sitting on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge also First Nations people on lands where others are meeting on today. If we can go, Shadman, please, to the next slide. There are three topics that I'd like to speak to today, exploring the idea of urban creativity, collectives, and public culture, with a focus upon research emerging between myself and two collectives: the Survive Garage collective in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and the Animatism Collective, a group of artists working between Timor-Leste and Australia, of which I co-founded with Timorese collaborators in 2010. These three topics existed before COVID-19, yet are now undeniably pronounced and splintered as a result of this context. The first is the idea of an aesthetic decree developed through the grid. The second is to nod to street art and graffiti and its proposition as a practice and ethos that spawns attunement to affect. And the third point will be looking at in what ways rhythm might scaffold creative cross-cultural collaboration. Throughout the year 2020, what has Sanctuary looked like for you? In Melbourne, life has been composed of the COVID-19 context of a city with an amplified closure, temporal and spatial injunctions regulating engagement with the world around you, through a 6+ week period of an 8 p.m. curfew, a 5-kilometre restriction upon movement from home in a 1-hour window with one other person only. Jackknifed, as we have been, into the repeating motifs of ourselves being multiple selves in one location, the home. Here, the spinning wheel of techne sharpens, splinters, morphs, and converges all the things you think you are. Failings, a fluid foundation for the aspiration of tomorrow. Overwhelm, a metronomic itch that can't be scratched. Home, a deepened emotional battlefield. Might it be that home, if one is fortunate enough to infer the grandiose claim of sanctuary upon a home, is no longer a location of retreat? With an attunement to the atmospheric guiding a creative social practice as research project, I found sanctuary, retreat even, in the space I often do, the streets. And it is these streets and their material and non-materiality that connect myself and my collaborators. By imposing boundaries upon the boundaries structuring my engagement with the public sphere, I sought the sanguine through the grid. Here, I found sanctuary in the serial, sanctuary in the surreal. Next slide, please, Shadman. Conceptually plundered, the grid, a fixed, contained vision of structure, is indebted beyond the artistic, aesthetic, and mathematic to organising principles predicated upon the management of aspiration, control, and administration of cities. As anthropologist James C. Scott infers in Seeing Like a State, the grid places an emphasis on simplification, legibility, straight lines, central management, and a synoptic grasp of the ensemble, end quote. The Hoddle grid was the nucleus for settlers regulating the unregulated fledgling settlement of Melbourne. My imposition of a grid of engagement with my surroundings was to place the active application of this broader historical context of my location into dialogue with the theoretical insights of Rosalind Krauss's theory of grids, seeking what Krauss refers to as an aesthetic decree. Next slide, please, Shadman. In this way, a daily engagement with practice and leisure emerged through containment. A 1-hour walk affixed to a topographic grid of streets to tease out the translation of affect into a tangible visual expression. Here, in a counterintuitive sanctuary developed through the grid, the words of Rosalind Krauss bind the grid's seriality to the possibility of the surreal. For in the grid, as Krauss enthuses, we have discovered that one of the most modernist things about it is its capacity to serve as a paradigm or model for the anti-developmental, the anti-narrative, the anti-historical, end quote. Through this technique, I'm not so much representing reality, but perceiving it. The grid, in this guise, is a form of interruption to pictorial veracity. Next slide, please, Shadman. The process of my image making and of seeking sanctuary in the streets is indebted to graffiti. Through the lineage of the form of graffiti, a particular urban interrelationship emerges that pivots from the breaking down of letters and the quest for visibility. This quest functions in an interdisciplinary way. In the context of an urban vernacular, it disturbs the structures that comprise language itself. In the context of urbanity, it demonstrates a discursive public space, generating a communicative arena with an unregulated panache for hijacking the semiotics that guide and regulate us. In a theoretical guise, there is value to appreciate graffiti as a method for an engagement with urbanity, for it is replete with a certain disposition towards the world and structure. Now, this disposition, like so much that emerges between the polis and the people, is riddled with conflicting viewpoints, standards, expectations, rights, and responsibilities. What surfaces through the lens of graffiti practice is an urban art form that is wedded to the social, an idea now so strongly at stake, the political, and issues indebted to negotiating centre-periphery concerns. Part of Henri Lefebvre's thesis into rhythm analysis revolves around a right to centrality. Thematically bound then are graffiti and the publicly practicing, deinstitutionalized collectives I work with, intermingling with public culture and urban experiences as a material source, refracting narratives back into public spaces and sanctuaries of collective action, peripheral to the centrality of state, institution, and commodification. Next slide, please, Shadman. Drawn in this way, and with the centre-periphery proposal in mind, graffiti weaves itself into dialogue with the proposition of epistemologies of the South, a theoretical body that allows us to think in a critically different way about the construction, not only social, but also potentially colonial, of the concept of art and cultural engagement. Southern theory advocates for new processes of production and valorization of valid knowledges, whether scientific or non-scientific, and of new relations among different types of knowledge on the basis of the practices of the classes and social groups that have suffered in a systemic way the oppression and discrimination of colonialism and capitalism. Here, hybrid forms, non-representational rhythms and affect gather solidarity and galvanize practice in, as Portuguese social theorist Boaventura de Sousa Santos espouses, the interstices in the rhythms and silences and partners in conversation. End quote. My photography is a direct descendant of this lineage of graffiti, cross-cultural practice and rhythm. It is concerned with the configuration of a series of shapes that construct a language. This language is drawn from the vernacular of what the Situationist International espoused as the spectacle. Empty signifies reigning upon the imagination of human sovereignty. As such, it is a détournement. Next slide, please, Shadman. I methodically hijack the colours, patterns, text, and textures I source from the city to develop an abstracted expression of space in order to understand the urban landscape more fully. This process now scaffolds a method of cross-cultural collaboration between urban-based artist collectives in Timor-Leste and Yogyakarta. Our collaborations a crosshatch of interconnectedness that might pervert the traditional order of rationalist thought, namely the grid, by exploiting the interstitial spaces of that grid, of structure, to present a détournement to deploy intermedial collaborations through a research project developed to understand the nature, contexts, and importance of public culture for art collectives in these locations. Next slide, please. Now, this journey began as a teenager with a spray can, but took an inherently social and political turn in Timor-Leste, where the artists I have collaborated with for 15 years now consistently imparted to me how important the feel or the affect of the wall is to their embellishment of it. It is this idea of effect that sustains my evolving aesthetic. It is this idea of effect that grows more and more fascinating when working between these cultures creatively. And it is this sensory, non-material quality that I want to understand as it is manifest in these contexts, where colonial assumptions of art and its relation to urban politics become entangled in differential collaborative relations to the event. In order to analyze a rhythm, Henri Lefebvre states, one must get outside it. Externality is necessary. And yet, in order to grasp a rhythm, one must have been grasped by it, have given or abandoned oneself inwardly to the time that it rhythmed, end quote. As a photographer and researcher, my career thus far has been wedded to the photographic form as a tool for the documentation of the events, or the festival, as Lefebvre would refer to it, that have created atmosphere with an enduring collaborative focus with Timor-Leste artists. Next slide, please. Through this developing method of non-representational photographic engagement, I am developing a tool to begin building the architecture for creating the atmospheres from inside the event that I once documented, renegotiating the center periphery and my location upon that axis. In developing a visual vocabulary of effect to translate knowledge in understanding the conditions, compulsions, and motivations of my collaborators is to shed light upon the inherently social materialism embedded in their everyday lives and engagement with creativity and public space. Through the visual encoding of rhythms as a foundation point of collaboration, we lend ourselves to issues of change and repetition, identity and difference, contrast and continuity. Through measuring these affective transactions, my research aims to realize the aesthetic and social complexity of the displacement of life on the street for artists whose practices revolve around being in the street. Next slide, please. To engage in this way is to understand the aesthetic practices and politics of art collectives working together and independently across the region, inviting narratives and methods of connectivity and collaboration within our region. By elaborating upon the sensory as it materializes in their engagement with public space, I trace and accommodate the multi-pronged approaches of creative practices situated in a broader field of public culture in cities where practices operationalize the city as the working material. Spawned, as this endeavor has been, through the grid, graffiti, and rhythm. Thank you.